Good day, good day. This is Pastor Theo, and I am recording this message which serves more as a lesson, a teaching on Maundy, Thursday. I was just mentioning Maundy, Thursday to one of my dear brothers recently, and he had never even heard of Maundy, Thursday. And so I want to be able to bring this message, this teaching, to give some background, some insight into exactly what Maundy, Thursday is. Maundy, Thursday is the day before Good Friday. And many people know about Good Friday. We know about Resurrection Sunday. Well, Maundy, Thursday is the day before Good Friday. And there were lots of things that Jesus did on this particular day that we commemorate. I'm going to primarily, during this teaching, focus on what he did that constituted the title Maundy, Thursday, and that was that he gave what was known in the Latin as a mandatum. A mandatum, which is Latin for mandate or commandment. So it was on Maundy, Thursday that Jesus gave the mandatum novum, which was a new commandment to his disciples. This is primarily found in the book of John. The account in John talks about how Jesus gave this new commandment. But if you know me, I like to be able to give some context so that we can properly connect the dots. And this will give us a greater and deeper understanding as well as an appreciation to why Jesus gave the commandment and how we should now, as his modern day disciples, continue to live out that new commandment. So I'm going to take my time, and that's the beauty of shooting this video versus a Sunday morning service. I can take my time. And this video is going to be one of many videos. There's going to be a video that I released for Good Friday, as well as another video by another dear brother, Brother Lee Boone. He's going to also do a video for Good Friday. And then we'll also supplement those videos with a message that I'll preach for Good Friday service, as well as for the Easter/Resurrection Sunday service. And so I'm super excited about this opportunity to teach on Maundy, Thursday, because when it comes to the Holy Week, it is a day that I did not hear about growing up, but I think it's important that we see exactly what Jesus was doing in his last moments before Good Friday. All right, so I have gone through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in order to glean out different passages that will help give us some context. So as you can see by this timeline that I put on the screen, it shows the accounts from the various Gospels. What you're going to find out about Jesus' disciples, they did not always write about the same stories. And even when they wrote about the same stories, they didn't always detail the same elements. Their personalities came out, what they valued, what they thought was most important, what they really wanted to highlight. So I think it's important to look at the accounts in all the Gospels in order to get a better feel and understanding for what was going on during that time. So first, looking at Matthew, and I'm not going to look at the scriptures thoroughly in each book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but I will read through the selected passages in what I've put together as the combined timeline. But right now, I'm just looking at Matthew just so that you would have an idea of what were some of the things Matthew was highlighting. So in Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 through 5, we see that there is a plot to kill Jesus. This is when it was one of the many times when the Pharisees and other scribes and other leaders plotted to kill Jesus. And then in Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16, we see and read that where Judas agrees to betray Jesus. And then in Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 through 30, we have combined passages where Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples. And it's also the time when he institutes the Lord's Supper. And then finally in Matthew, we have Jesus predicting Peter's denial. Now, there's some other things that took place on Maundy, Thursday. One of the most crucial times was Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I've preached on that message a couple of times. I'm going to more than likely do a video on that in the future. So for the purposes of this video, I really want to focus on when Jesus gave the new commandment. So I'm going to end every timeline in regards to when Jesus predicts Peter's denial. Quickly, we're going to move on to the book of Mark. And Mark, for the most part, mirrors what we saw in Matthew. The plot to kill Jesus in Mark 14, verses 1 through 2. Judas agreeing to betray Jesus in 14, verses 10 and 11. Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples and instituting the Lord's Supper in chapter 14, verses 12 through 26. And finally, Jesus predicting Peter's denial in chapter 14, verses 27 through 31. Luke has a similar yet different timeline in terms of one thing that's very distinct. It does start off with the plot to kill Jesus, like the other two Gospels. This is found in chapter 22, verses 1 through 6. And it doesn't distinguish the plot to kill Jesus from the time when Judas agrees to betray Jesus. That's kind of all combined in one passage. And then next we find in chapter 22, verses 7 through 23, this is where Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples and institutes the Lord's Supper. Now, there is a story that Luke touches on that Matthew and Mark and John did not touch on, and I think it's very important to Maundy, Thursday, and that is when Jesus' disciples argue about who is the greatest among them. And this is found in Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 30. And I'm going to break that down more when we get to the combined timeline. And then finally, just as the previous two Gospels, Luke's timeline for the intensive purposes for this video ends with Jesus predicting Peter's denial. This is in chapter 22, verses 31 through 34. And then finally, we have the book of John. Like the other three previous Gospels, it starts off with a plot to kill Jesus. This is found in chapter 11, verses 45 through 57. Then something distinct, Jesus predicts his death. So this is him coming to grips with the fact that he's going to soon die. This is found in chapter 12 of John, verses 27 through 41. Then here's where there is some distinctions that are very important to what took place on Maundy, Thursday. And that is, we read in chapter 13 of the book of John, verses 1 through 17, that Jesus washed his disciples' feet. This is very important. And then we read in the following verses, chapter 13, verses 18 through 30, here's when Jesus, in the midst of all his disciples, identifies his soon coming betrayer. He identifies the one who would soon betray him. And then we have in the chapter 13, verses 31 through 35, the passage that we utilize now in terms of distinguishing Maundy, Thursday, where we get that Maundy, where we get that mandatum novum, that new commandment, that new mandate, that's found in chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. This is when Jesus gives his disciples the new commandment. Then Jesus predicts Peter's denial in chapter 13, verses 36 through 38. And then finally, Jesus expounds upon that new commandment that he gave. He gave the commandment in chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. He expounds upon it in chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. He enlightens his disciples a little bit more about what he means by that new commandment. And then finally, what I did was I took all of those timelines, those passages, and I reconciled them all in order to get a combined timeline that would give us a more complete picture from start to finish what happened on that day, excluding what happened in the garden. So we're talking about up until then. And I'm going to now go through that timeline, taking the time to read through each passage and giving some brief teaching when needed. I'm going to primarily focus on the passage where Jesus gives the new commandment. So let us first start in the book of Luke. And we're going to be going from gospel to gospel. In the case where all three gospels or all four gospels told the same story, such as the plot to kill Jesus, I chose the story that gives the most detail, the story that gives the most background information that would be most helpful for us to understand why it was important that Jesus gave his disciples this new commandment. The backdrop, he's been walking with his disciples for years now. Sometimes they're getting it, sometimes they're not getting it. Sometimes they're ministering and they're showing that they know who he is and what he was called to do. And sometimes they seemingly are clueless to this fact. And now his days are drawing nigh, and he really has to get even more serious about making sure that they are totally equipped for his departure. So we're going to pick it up, like I said, in the book of Luke, chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, we're going to read about the plot to kill Jesus. And this is Luke chapter 22, verses 1 through 6. Luke chapter 22, verses 1 through 6. And it reads, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, being Jesus, for they feared the people." So they're already plotting. Jesus is going to be in town for Passover. We're seeing all this attention he's getting. We're seeing how the people are gravitating towards him and starting to believe. We need to put an end to this. And then in verse 3 it says, "Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he was one of Jesus' 12. They're making it clear. We want to have this revisionist history that maybe Judas truly wasn't one of Jesus' disciples. No, he was one of the trusted 12. He was in that inner circle, and that's what makes the portrayal that much damaging. He was one of the brothers. It says Satan entered into him. So he, being Judas, went away and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. So they haven't even approached Jesus yet. They're over here plotting about how we can kill Jesus. And it says, unbeknownst to them, apart from them, Satan enters into Judas's heart. And we must know who Judas is. Judas was one of the disciples who kept the money box. And we read in other passages how he embezzled, how he skimmed off the top, how he would always keep some for himself. So he was a thief, and he was motivated by greed. So he already had a heart that was fertile for Satan to enter in to portray Jesus in terms of turning him over to the authorities, because he had already portrayed Jesus in so many other ways. Sometimes we would want to think that we would never portray Jesus the way that Judas betrayed Jesus, but we should be careful as to look into our heart and look in our hands to see if there's any other areas of our life that we've already started to portray him. Because if we portrayed him in that area, we're fooling ourselves to think that we wouldn't portray him in other areas. We like to think that if we were the disciples, we would be the ones who got it right. Not Judas, but the great thing about this story, we're going to see that all have their faults, including us. So it says he went to them to see how he could betray him, and they were glad and agreed to give him money. They were glad because he is now going to help them fulfill the plan that they were already plotting. And it says they were glad and agreed to give him money, so he promised and sought the opportunity to portray him being Jesus to them in the absence of the multitude. All right? So this particular passage by itself kind of combines the plot to kill Jesus with Judas agreeing to do so. So I could just leave that as it is. However, I do want to read one more passage that deals with Jesus, the time when Judas does make it up in his heart and his mind to betray Jesus, because I think it's important that we continue to get into his mind. That way we would know how we can sense when we ourselves are falling into that trap. So we're going to look in the book of Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16. Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16. This is Judas agreeing to betray Jesus. And it says, then one of the 12, once again making it clear that he was one of them, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? So now what we're getting out of this passage that we didn't hear distinctly in the last passage is Judas he's not even beating around the bush. He's like, hey, I'm willing to do what y'all need to be done. I just want to know, what are you willing to give me in exchange? What is the cost for what I'm about to do? He's saying that I'm not going to do what I'm going to do for free. I'm going to do it, but you got to pay me. And what we read, it says, and they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought the opportunity to betray him. So from that time on, he was on the clock looking for the best time to serve Jesus up, and he did it for 30 pieces of silver. I think it's important that we know how much it was, because we would like to think that for no amount of money will we serve up Jesus. For no amount of money will we sell out God. For no amount of money will we turn our back on him, or even on the other people that we love. Yet maybe Judas probably thought the same thing at one time. We saw how he ended up. But it was more important than the 30 pieces of silver, because the number, the value, the amount isn't what persuaded him. He was persuaded already in his heart by the enemy, who latched himself to Judas's greed, the darkness that was already within his heart. That's important. Next, we're going to read about when Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples, and he institutes the Lord's Supper. For this account, we're going to turn to the book of Luke, chapter 22. And I'm just laying the groundwork, and this is important because we want to be able to take a passage and just take it out of context. But I think the context, and we can still preach this passage with great context, even without me doing this, but I think the context is going to be important because it's going to let us get into Jesus' mind and heart in terms of why it was important that before he left, he's on his way to be crucified. He has all these other things on his mind, yet he found it important to give his disciples this one last new commandment. Why was that so important? Well, we're painting the picture of why that was so important. We already have one of his disciples who has made up in his heart to betray him. And we're going to see that some of the other disciples, they also have some of their shakiness and some of their flaws, and they're not always getting it. And that's why it's going to be important that Jesus just melts everything down and says, hey, here's what I need y'all to do before I leave. So we're going to look in chapter 22 of Luke at the Lord's Supper and the Passover. This is starting in verses 7. So this is Luke chapter 22, verse 7, and it says, Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he, being Jesus, sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. So he sends these two ahead to prepare the Passover that he and the rest of the disciples, including Judas, may eat. So they said to him, Where do you want us to prepare? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, The teacher, that being Jesus, says to you, Where is the guest room, that I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large furnished upper room, and there make ready. So they went and found it just as he said to them, and they prepared the Passover. All right? Now, during this Passover meal, this is when Jesus is going to institute what we now know as the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, communion, the holy sacraments. And it says in chapter 22, verse 14, Now when the hour had come, he sat down, he being Jesus, and the 12 apostles with him, 12, so Judas is still there. Then he said to them with fervent desire, I desire to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. He's like, I'm about to suffer. I got a lot on my mind. I got a lot on my heart. I got a lot weighing down on my spirit. I got a lot on my table right now, but I desire more than anything before I go suffer to have this last meal with you all, this Passover. And he says, For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine until the kingdom comes. So he's talking about the wine now. And then he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And that is why we take time throughout our Sunday service. For us, it has been the first Sunday of the month. For different churches, it can be at different times, where we share in the Lord's table. We share in the wine or grape juice or whatever it is that you serve that was poured out on our behalf. And we share in the bread or the wafer or the cracker, whatever it is you serve, that was broken. And those two things represent his blood and his body. And this is where he's first instituting this. And remember the backdrop. This is in the midst of his disciples, one who is going to betray him. Judas is there. The betrayer is right there. And the Lord is still serving, still reminding them of the value of their continue community, continue communion long after he is gone. And it says in verse 20, likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this is the cup of my new covenant of my blood, which is shared for you. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. Here you have Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, doing such a wonderful job instituting this holy moment, this holy communion. And then he says, but there is something also unholy going on in the midst. That although I am breaking bread and sharing this with you all, disciples, there is one among you who has already made up in his heart to betray me. The betrayer was there. And he says, truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to the man by whom he is betrayed. So he's saying, my calling, my purpose, my destiny will be fulfilled because it's the Father's will. That's a done deal. But make no mistake, the one who turns me over, the one who is made up in his heart to betray me, woe unto him. He doesn't get to say, well, it was Jesus' destiny and purpose to die. Why should I now suffer? Well, it was his destiny to die, but that wasn't necessarily mean that you had to be one to serve him up. And so he's saying, woe to the one who will betray me. And then we read in verse 23, then they, being the disciples, began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do such a thing. So they are questioning among themselves, who is going to betray our Lord? That's important. I would think you would believe that if you were a trusted disciple and the master accused one of doing something, that you would know well if it was not you who were going to do that thing. But the fact that they did not immediately say to themselves, oh, he must be talking about Judas. It says they questioned among themselves who he was referring to. This is important. They are wondering amongst themselves, who is Jesus talking about? Why is that important? They could have easily, as soon as Jesus said, my betrayer is amongst us, they could have all turned and said, oh, he must be talking about Judas. We've had our eye on him. We know that he is a thief. We know that he is deceitful. He was one of the last ones that joined us anyway. Oh, it makes a lot of sense. But instead it says they began to question among themselves which one of them that it would be that would do such a thing. Why is it important? It drives home the point that none of the disciples were so rock solid in their beliefs. They were not so rock solid in their practices. They were not so rock solid in the faith that they did not know that they themselves were beyond that type of reproach. If the master goes to the group of disciples and says, one of you are going to do such and such a thing, if they were secure in who they were in the master, if they were secure in the fact that they're doing what the master has called them to do, they would not begin to question whether he was referring to them. But the fact that they wondered who he was referring to, it reminds us that all of us at any given moment can be one that betrays our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That we should put no confidence in the flesh, lest we fall. So he has instituted this supper. Now what we're going to do is transition to the book of John, who uniquely tells the story about Jesus washing his feet. So now we're in the book of John, chapter 13. John chapter 13, and it reads, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended," so this is letting us know where we're at in the timeline. It's saying the supper, the same supper in which he has just instituted, the Holy Communion, that supper has now ended. All right? So it says, supper having been ended, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas, because we read in a previous passage that Satan entered into Judas's heart, we're being reminded that at this point, his heart is already made up. His mind is already made up. Satan is already in control in terms of what Judas is going to do next. And it says, Satan having already entered into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, he rose from supper. So he got up from the table and he laid aside his garments. So the garments that Jesus was wearing, we now read he lays those aside, and he took a towel and he girded himself. In other words, now he is putting on the garments, he is dressing himself, he is preparing himself in the way of a servant. Having his normal garments put to the side, now he takes this towel and he girds himself. He wraps it around him in a similar fashion that a servant would be dressed when he is about to serve the master. So here you have the master now making himself in the likeness of a lowly servant. This is important. He is going to demonstrate and model before his disciples what it truly means to be great. Because remember, they argued already about who was the greatest among them. And we're going to talk about that. That is important. They're wondering who is the greatest? Who is the greatest? Who is the greatest? And now Jesus corrects them and he lets them know, here's what I need you to do. Here's how I'm going to serve. All right? So it says he rose from supper and laid aside his garments. Jesus took a towel, girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and he began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he had girded himself. This is an act that really drives home Jesus' humility, Jesus' intentionality in making himself low, the one who would not come to be served, but to serve. He's demonstrating that the chief priest, the chief teacher, the master is now voluntarily, intentionally humbling himself by engaging in this act that would be normally reserved for someone who is a servant, by washing his disciples' feet. And then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? And he says it in a way that kind of like, what are you doing? And Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing, you do not understand now, but you will know after this. He's saying the way I've humbled myself, the way I've become the chief servant, you're not understanding that yet, but you're going to know once you see the ultimate sacrifice. Once you see how I truly humble myself. And it says, Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. And he's not saying it in a bad way. He's saying, no, I should be washing your feet. I'm the disciple. You're the master. You're the teacher. You shouldn't be the one washing my feet. But Jesus responds, Simon Peter, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. You claim to be one of mine. You desire to partake in me and in the things I'm doing. But if you truly want to be in with me, you can't be ingrained and you can't be grafted in to this thing I'm doing unless I cleanse you. And what he was doing literally in terms of washing the feet would symbolically serve as a foretelling of how he would ultimately make Peter, the rest of the disciples, and all to come clean through the shedding of his blood, through the sacrifice that he made for us on the cross. But he's saying to them, I need you to understand the concept first. That as the master, I know why I was sent. Regardless of what you think I should be doing, I know I was sent to be humbled, to be made low, and then to be exalted on the cross. To be raised up on the cross. For you. And for all to come. So unless I wash you, unless I make you clean, you have no part in me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only then, but also my hands and my head. So he said, okay, I get it. Well, if you're going to be cleaning my feet, you might as well go and do my head and my hands too to make sure my whole body gets clean. But Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet. He said, normally when they had bathed and their bodies were clean, their feet would get dirty because of traveling barefoot on the dirt roads. So when you would enter into a new town, into someone's home, the custom was just to wash the feet, presuming the rest of the body was clean. And with Jesus saying that if you've been bathed in me, all I have to do is just tidy you up right now to clean your feet. He says, but he needs only the feet cleansed because he's completely clean. And reminds him, you are clean, but not all of you. And now he's referring to Judas. He's letting Peter know, don't worry, you're all right. But there's one among you who is not clean, who's dirty, not just feet, but dirty in his heart. And it says, so when he had washed, and he was talking about the one who would betray him, he said, you are not clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. You say, well, for I am. He said, yes, you refer to me as teacher, Lord, master, and rightfully so, I am those things. But furthermore, it says, if I am those things, if I am your Lord and teacher, and if I've washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. So he's saying, if me, the one who is the chief among you, the master, the Lord, the teacher, if I have so humbled myself and washed your feet, let that serve as a demonstration and a model of how you ought furthermore wash each other's feet. Serve one another the way that I have served you. And remember, this is on the backdrop of one of them being captivated in the heart by Satan to betray. The disciples have in the past argued among themselves about who was the greatest. And Jesus demonstrated that technically, quiet as kept, obviously I'm the greatest. And yet, being the greatest, I have voluntarily humbled myself to serve you. Let that be a model going forward to serve one another. And he's demonstrating that by doing something that's one of the most humble acts of washing their feet. And he says, for I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than the master. He's reminding them, you all are not greater than me as the master. So if I do something, how much more should you be willing to do that same thing? A servant is not greater than the master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. So now he's talking about his relationship with the Father, how he, although equal in essence to God the Father, Jesus the Son, God the Son, voluntarily submits himself. And now he's also saying, you being the ones I'm going to send aren't greater than I am. And since you're not greater than I am, anything that I humbly do, you should humbly also do. And he says, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. He doesn't simply say that the blessing is in the knowing. He says, blessed are you who now know and then follow up, follow through, do these things. Sometimes we'd be better off not knowing than knowing and not doing. They can't plead ignorance. And as we are now getting into these scriptures, learning about this passage, we can't plead ignorance either. Because we are his disciples also. So this is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. I have a few more passages. We're going to now look, we're going to stay in the book of John. Now looking at verses 18. So Jesus just washed his disciples' feet. And that includes Judas, because Judas is still here. We're going to still read that Judas was still among them. So although Jesus knew that Satan had entered into Judas's heart, Jesus still humbly washed his feet. So now you're not only washing the feet of those who you love and those who love you, we also see him washing the feet of one who made up in his mind and his heart to betray him. So we're talking about this is some great level of humility and great level of love and care that Jesus is exemplifying. In John chapter 13 verses 8 it says, I do not speak concerning all of you. He says this love fest that we're having, the fact that you're going to be all right if you know and you obey. He says, I'm not referring to all of you. Because Jesus was probably thinking, he has no clue what's about to happen. Jesus knew exactly what he was about to do. He says, I am not speaking concerning all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. So he's saying one of you who is breaking bread with me is going to now be one who tries to stump me out. Now I tell you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am him. So he's saying, I want to tell y'all ahead of time what's going to happen. That way when it happens, y'all will believe. Most assuredly I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me. And he who receives me receives him who sent me. So he says, he who receives any of my disciples, any of my sent out ones, any of my children, then you by default effectively receive Christ. You receive Jesus. And he says, he who receives Jesus has received the Father who sent him. Now when Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another perplexed about whom he spoke. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples. And it says that this disciple was the one whom Jesus loved. That would be John. Then Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was to whom he spoke. So it's just like some kids, mom and dad then said one of us in trouble. Now we're trying to figure out who it is. So Simon Peter didn't want to ask Jesus himself who he's referring to. So he asked the disciple whom Jesus loved, being John, hey, ask Jesus who he's talking about. I want to make sure it's not me. We want to find out who this person is who's going to betray him. So it says, Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was that Jesus spoke about. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, this disciple, being John, said to him, Lord, who is it? Once again, this is important. If Judas was the only one who had failings, if Judas was the only one who had faults, if Judas was the only one who demonstrated any inclination of the ability to get off track, they would have known from the beginning he must be talking about Judas, because he's the only one among us who has exhibited any type of behaviors that show that he is contrary to who our master is. But the fact that they are genuinely confused about who he's talking to is just like when your parents come to you and ask who did it, and or your parents come to you and say one of you are in trouble. They don't even say what you're in trouble for, and you know what you did. You're in trouble and you know what you did. And all of us would sit there with this look on our face, and it's the look of we're in our minds trying to figure out what it was that we did. None of us said to ourselves, oh, they can't be talking about us. No, we were genuinely trying to figure out, what did I do last night? What did I do this morning? Because I know I did some stuff I shouldn't have been doing. Do they know what I did? Are they talking about me? Are they setting me up? Are they fishing? See if I'm going to confess? But there is a genuine concern that they may be talking about me, or they may be talking about my sister, whoever it may be. None of us ever had the certainty that we had escaped consequences for some dirt that we did. And it seems that they're in that same boat. They don't know who it is because they know that they all have a capacity within themselves based upon other instances in the Bible to not get it right. And it says, Jesus says, it is he whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now, after the piece of bread, Satan entered him. So it's like Satan had already planted some seeds. Now it's saying he is full blown in Judas's heart. There's no turning back now. Satan has entered him, captivated and held captive Judas. Then Jesus said to him, what you do, do it quickly. It's like when one of your boys is about to do you in, you're like, whatever you're going to do, get over with. I already know it's you. You know, already make that. Well, gee, there's no need to explain. There's no need to justify. We're not going to negotiate. I'm not going to talk you out of it because you already got your heart and mind made up. Whatever you're going to do it quickly, because quiet is kept. Whatever you're going to do, you've already done in your heart. So he says, whatever you're going to do it quickly. But no one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. For some thought, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus had said to him, buy those things we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So they still don't know that Jesus is saying that Judas is the betrayer, which once again lets us know that it wasn't cut and dry that he was the only one with this capability. The others are still confused about who it could be, even after Jesus has said what he has said. And then having received the piece of bread, he, being Judas, went out, and immediately it was night. He went out immediately and it was night. I'm almost finished, y'all. We have arrived to John 13 verses 31 through 35. This is when Jesus gives the mandatum novum, the new commandment. And what I've been doing up until now is setting the background, the backdrop of why this new commandment was so important. One of Jesus' trusted disciples has made up in his heart to betray him. In another passage, if we would have taken the time to read that, the other disciples argue amongst themselves about who is the greatest. They're fighting over who is the greatest disciple, and Jesus tells them the chief servant, the chief disciple, the greatest among them must become the chief servant, the greatest servant. And the word is actually become a slave to the other. Then Jesus himself demonstrates this servanthood by being the master who intentionally and practicing humility made himself low and served his servants by washing their feet. So he's modeling for them what it means. If you want to be great, make yourself low. If you want to be the greatest among you, become the greatest servant, the greatest slave. While you're too busy thinking about yourself, because Judas was motivated by greed, and you're too busy thinking about yourselves as you're arguing about who is the greatest, me, I, Jesus, who was truly the greatest, demonstrated humility, lowliness. And now he's going to tell them this new commandment. And in verse 31 of John chapter 13, we read, so when he had gone out, we're talking about Judas, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. And it's glorified because now it has been set into motion that Jesus is soon going to die. And if God is glorified in him, God would also glorify him in himself and glorify him immediately. Then he says to them, little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. My time is drawing nigh. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment, a mandatum novum, I give to you. Remember, we already had the 10 commandments that he gave to Moses have been passed down. He reduced those 10 to 2, and then took that 2 and combined it into one all-encompassing. Love God with your heart, your mind, and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And now he's going to give them a new commandment. something that they needed to hear specifically because of all the things that they have been exhibiting. How they've been making it about themselves, exalting themselves, seeing themselves more highly than they ought, and not even being able to show Jesus support in his time of greatest need because they're too busy thinking about themselves. He says, on top of loving God with all you have, and on top of loving your neighbor as yourself, here is a new commandment I give you. And it says that you love one another as I have loved you. And he's talking about the way that he's loved them up until this point. He's talking about how he just demonstrated servanthood and humility and how he served them. And he's also foreshadowing the type of love that he's going to demonstrate, the ultimate love when he dies for them and subsequently dies for us all. He says, love one another as I have loved you. And this is why it's important. By this love, all will know that you are my disciples. What he is saying is, you who want to be the chief and greatest among the disciples, people aren't going to know that you belong to me based upon your preaching, based upon the miracles that you wrought, based upon your giving, based upon different types of service that you may do. They're going to know that you belong to me based upon the love that you have one for another. If you truly want to be the greatest disciple, you must demonstrate the greatest love one for another. And then it's after this, immediately after this, that Jesus predicts Peter's denial. And he says, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterwards. You're going to follow me afterwards. You too will die, but you can't come with me right now. Peter said to the Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. Here you have Peter, once again, saying, here's what I will do. And in another account, Peter says, even if all others forsake you. Because Jesus told his disciples that what I'm about to do will cause you all to be stumbled and to be scattered. What's going to happen to me when I get crucified, when I get brutally murdered, it's going to cause all of you to stumble, all of you to flee, all of you to scatter. So don't just look poorly upon Judas as a betrayer. He's saying, yes, he has betrayed me, but just know your time is coming too, where you're going to have the opportunity to also show that you're not as rock solid as you thought. You all are going to stumble and flee. And it's within that context that Peter is saying, no, even if all others flee, I will remain. I am willing to die for your sake. And Jesus says, most assuredly I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. So he's predicting that Peter will also deny him. And we saw this come to pass. Why is this important? Because Jesus is pointing out the fact that I've been with you all for a while. I'm giving you this new commandment to love one another, to be the chief servants among one another. Yet, Peter, you're still sitting here acting like you're greater than the rest, saying that the rest may scatter, the rest may stumble, the rest may forsake you, Jesus, but I'll never forsake you. So Jesus is giving this new commandment because he's catching wind that they're still not fully grasping it. They're still not fully grasping what it means to be the greatest. To be the greatest means to be the greatest servant, to be the chief slave, to be the one who doesn't look at yourself more highly than you ought, but to make yourself low. And Jesus says, I'm not just going to communicate that to you, I'm going to demonstrate it to you by washing your feet. And if you think that is something, wait till I demonstrate it to you when I die upon the cross. And then the last thing we're going to do to conclude this message, in order that they would have no confusion about what it meant to love one another. Because he says, here is the last commandment I give, this new commandment, that you love one another the way that I love you. They may think to themselves, well, what does that love look like? Well, we read about this in chapter 15. Starting in verse 9, it says, as the Father loved me, I also love you. So abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Because remember, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. So don't tell me you love me. That's what he's saying. Don't continue to tell me you love me. Demonstrate that you love me by abiding in my commandments, following my word, following my example, especially this new commandment I've just given you. And he says, these things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. So he repeats that mandatum novum, that you love one another just as I have loved you. But then he expounds upon it, and he puts some action to that love by letting them know no greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. He's saying, before y'all get excited about this new commandment, yeah, love one another, yeah. Just know, when I say love one another, there's no greater love than to lay down your life for a friend. And he's going to demonstrate to them that this is what he's going to do. So he makes it clear. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all things I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain. And the fruit that remains, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest among that is love. That whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. These things I command you, that you love one another. So he drives home that point. Love one another. Love one another. Love one another. And by the way, to love one another, there's no greater way to demonstrate that love than to lay down your life for your friends. And by the way, you're my friends, so I'm going to lay down my life for you. And then remember, I've already said, love one another the way that I've loved you. So now I expect you to be willing to lay down your lives for each other. So when we think about Maundy, Thursday, it is important that we have a better understanding of what it is, because then it gives us a better appreciation for what Christ did on Good Friday. He didn't just die for the sake of dying. It was love that compelled him. That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. While we were yet sinners, the Father sent his only begotten Son for us. And now he requires, not suggests, not recommends, but mandates, commands that we now love each other the way that he loved us. That way those who don't know him would know him and know that we belong to him by the love that we have for one another. And just in case we're confused about what that love looks like, are we willing to lay down our lives? And that doesn't necessarily have to mean physically, literally. It may come to that. But there's so many other ways in which we can be self-sacrificial for another. So many other ways in which we can prefer another to ourselves. So brothers and sisters, I hope that you have enjoyed this teaching. I know it was exhaustive. That's a good thing about video. Maybe you broke it up into different parts, but it was important that in order for us to truly appreciate what Christ did on the cross, when we commemorate and celebrate Good Friday, we should know what also took place on Maundy, Thursday. Now, keep in mind, I didn't touch on what happened in the garden. I'll say that for another video, maybe next year, who knows. But it was important to know that he had to give this new commandment to really drive home the point to his disciples, that if you want to be the greatest among you, if you want to share in who I am, demonstrate your love for me by obeying my commandments. And this new commandment I give you, love one another the way I've loved you, and no greater love than to lay down your life for another. Once again, this has been Pastor Theo Williams with this teaching on Maundy, Thursday. Hope you've enjoyed it. Take care. God bless.